Before we begin tonight's story, I invite you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, settle into your blankets, and let the sound of the rain wash over you. If you're enjoying this content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. And now, let me tell you about one of the most fascinating cases in forensic history. Picture this: Heilbronn, Germany. A small, picturesque city in the southwestern region of Baden-Württemberg, nestled along the Neckar River. April 25, 2007. A Wednesday afternoon, ordinary in almost every way. The spring air was cool, the city humming with its usual midday rhythm. But on a quiet green space called the Versailles, a park where locals walked their dogs and children played, something was about to happen that would shake not just this peaceful city, but the entire European law enforcement community. Two police officers sat in their patrol car during their lunch break. 22-year-old Michelle Kieswetter, a promising young officer with her whole career ahead of her, sat in the driver's seat. Her partner, 24-year-old Martin Arnold, sat beside her in the passenger seat. They had no idea that in the next few moments, their lives would change forever. Two gunmen approached from behind. Silently, methodically, without warning, shots rang out, execution style. Both officers were shot in the head at point-blank range. Michelle died almost instantly. Martin survived, but would spend months in a coma, emerging with life-altering injuries and no memory of what had happened. Their service weapons were stolen, their handcuffs gone. The crime scene was meticulously processed, as you would expect for the murder of a police officer. And that's when investigators found it: DNA evidence. Female DNA. Unknown female DNA. What police didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this DNA evidence was about to send them on a 16-year wild goose chase across 3 countries, hunting a killer who didn't exist. Phantom, the woman without a face. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most embarrassing, fascinating, and ultimately important cases in the history of forensic science. This is the story of the Phantom of Heilbronn. But our story doesn't begin in Heilbronn in 2007. It begins 14 years earlier in a completely different town. Let me take you back. May 1993, the small town of Idar-Oberstein, nestled in the German countryside, roughly 2.5 hours northwest of Heilbronn. Idar-Oberstein is known for its gemstone industry, its medieval churches, and its quiet, peaceful way of life. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where crime is rare. On May 25th, 62-year-old Lieselotte Schlenger was found dead in her rented apartment. Lieselotte was a church warden, a pensioner, a woman who had spent her life serving her community. She lived alone in a modest apartment, the kind of peaceful retirement many people dream of. But someone had taken that peace from her. She had been strangled, not with hands, but with a thin wire, the kind of wire used to tie together a bouquet of summer flowers. It was a brutal, intimate way to kill someone, the kind of murder that speaks of rage or perhaps cold calculation. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses. The investigation went cold almost immediately, but investigators did find something. On the rim of a teacup sitting on Lieselotte's kitchen table, they recovered a trace amount of genetic material, just enough to analyze. In 1993, DNA analysis was still relatively new to German law enforcement, but this sample was carefully preserved, cataloged, and entered into the system. And then nothing. The case sat unsolved for years. The DNA profile meant nothing without a match. Lieselotte Schlenger became another tragic cold case, a file gathering dust in some police archive. 8 years passed. Life went on. Technology advanced. DNA databases grew. And then, in March 2001, something remarkable happened. The city of Freiburg, in southwestern Germany, Joseph Walzenbach, a 61-year-old antiques dealer, was found dead in his home. Like Lieselotte, he had been strangled. But this time, the murder weapon was garden twine. Ordinary green garden twine, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. Again, no fingerprints, no witnesses, just another seemingly random murder of an elderly person. But when investigators swabbed the crime scene, they found something extraordinary: DNA. Female DNA. The same DNA from the Lieselot Schlenger murder 8 years earlier. Suddenly, what had been two unrelated cold cases became something else entirely. Pattern. Connection. The same killer. But who was she? What was her motive? Why elderly victims years apart in different towns? The police had no answers, just questions, and a DNA profile that matched no one in their databases. Later that same year, October 2001, the DNA appeared again. This time on a syringe containing heroin, found in a wooded area near Gerolstein, a drug-related case miles away from the murder scenes. Then on the leftovers of a cookie in a trailer that had been forcibly entered in Budenheim. Then on a toy pistol after a robbery of Vietnamese gemstone traders in Arbois, France. The phantom had crossed borders. The cases kept coming. A projectile after a fight between two brothers in Worms, Germany. A stone used to smash a window during a burglary in Saarbrücken. Inside the ruins of a disused public swimming pool following a break-in. At 4 different home invasions. At an apartment break-in. At the robbery of a woman in a clubhouse. In the car of an auxiliary nurse found dead near Weinsberg. By 2007, this unknown woman's DNA had been found at more than 40 crime scenes across Germany, Austria, and France. Murders, robberies, burglaries, drug cases. The crimes seemed to have no pattern, no consistency. The only connection was her DNA. She was everywhere and nowhere. The woman without a face. April 25, 2007. The Versailles in Heilbronn. The murder of Michelle Kieswetter changed everything. When a police officer is killed, the response is swift and overwhelming. This wasn't just another case where the phantom's DNA had appeared. This was personal. This was an attack on law enforcement itself. The entire country was watching. The crime scene was processed with extraordinary care. Every surface swabbed, every piece of evidence cataloged. And there it was, the phantom's DNA, inside the patrol car, at the scene where a 22-year-old police officer had been executed. The Heilbronn Police Department immediately formed a special task force. They called it Operation Parkplatz, parking lot, named for the location where Michelle and Martin had been attacked. Heilbronn police alone would eventually rack up 16,000 hours of overtime pursuing this case. 16,000 hours. The phantom now had a new name. She was no longer just the woman without a face. She was the Phantom of Heilbronn. Let me paint you a picture of what investigators thought they were dealing with. A female serial killer. In Europe, female serial killers are extraordinarily rare. Male serial killers often work alone, but female serial killers? The profile didn't fit any known pattern. She was connected to 6 murders at minimum, but she was also connected to petty burglaries, drug cases, car thefts. Her alleged accomplices ranged from Slovaks to Serbs, Albanians to Romanians. No pattern, no consistency. Her geographic range was staggering. Germany, Austria, France. Crimes stretching from 1993 to 2008. 15 years. How could one person commit crimes across such vast distances, across multiple countries, across such different types of offenses? And here's what made it even stranger. No one had ever seen her. Not once. Not a single eyewitness. Not a single security camera. Nothing. In some cases where eyewitnesses described the perpetrator, they described a man. A man. But the DNA was female. Some investigators began to theorize that she might be transgender. That would explain the male descriptions but female DNA. Others thought she was simply extraordinarily skilled at disguise. Maybe she worked with different criminal networks, hiring herself out as a kind of freelance criminal. A gun for hire, a burglar for hire. The media had a field day. Headlines screamed about Germany's most elusive serial killer. The papers called it the most mysterious serial crime of the past century. Television programs devoted entire episodes to profiling her. Psychological experts were brought in from across Europe to analyze her behavior patterns. A reward was offered, 50,000 euros at first. Then, in January 2009, it was increased to 300,000 euros. €300,000 for any information leading to the capture of the Phantom of Heilbronn. The police consulted everyone: profilers, psychologists, forensic experts. They even consulted diviners and fortune tellers, desperate for any lead, any clue. Nothing worked. She was a ghost. By 2008, some investigators were starting to have doubts. Think about it from their perspective for a moment. 40 crime scenes, 6 murders, dozens of burglaries and robberies, all connected by DNA, but nothing else added up. No pattern to the victims, no pattern to the locations, no pattern to the types of crimes, just DNA. In one particularly bizarre case from May 2005, a man shot his own brother with a pistol. A domestic dispute, the kind of case that happens in families sometimes, tragic as it is. But the Phantom's DNA was found on one of the bullets, on the bullet itself. How? Why? What possible reason would this supposed serial killer have to be involved in a random domestic shooting? In multiple burglary cases, other criminals had been caught and convicted. During their trials, these convicted criminals insisted they had worked alone. They had no idea who this phantom woman was. They denied her existence entirely, but her DNA was there, at the scenes, inside the stolen cars, on the stolen items. The Austrian police had analyzed the mitochondrial DNA from some of the samples. The results suggested the DNA came from someone of Eastern European descent, most likely from Eastern Europe or Western Russia. That was as specific as they could get. It narrowed the suspect pool to several million people. By April 2008, the German Federal Office for Criminal Investigation, the LKA, began quietly investigating another possibility. What if, and this was almost too embarrassing to consider, what if the DNA evidence itself was contaminated? They kept this investigation internal, secret. Can you imagine? After years of press conferences, after raising the reward to €300,000, after declaring this the most important criminal investigation in Germany, they were now quietly wondering if they had been chasing a phantom in the most literal sense. But how could that be possible? The DNA had been found at 40 different crime scenes in 3 different countries, processed by dozens of different laboratories and forensic technicians. How could all of that be contaminated? The investigators were meticulous. They began reviewing their procedures, checking their equipment, looking at their protocols. Everything seemed sound. The laboratories were clean. The technicians were trained. The evidence was handled properly. And then, in early 2009, something happened that would finally break the case wide open. Sometime in 2002, a man seeking asylum in Europe disappeared. His name isn't widely known. The records refer to him simply as a male asylum seeker. He had come from the Middle East, seeking refuge, seeking a new life, and then he vanished. 7 years later, in early 2009, French authorities discovered a badly burned body near the German-French border. The corpse was so severely damaged that identifying it through visual means was impossible. But the man had submitted fingerprints as part of his asylum application years earlier, and those prints were still on file. Investigators took a cotton swab, collected DNA from the fingerprint samples on the asylum application, and prepared to match it against the burned remains. It was routine procedure, a way to give the deceased their name back, a way to notify family members. But when the results came back, something was very, very wrong. The DNA from the male asylum seeker's fingerprints contained the phantom's DNA, the female DNA that had been found at 40 crime scenes, the DNA of the woman without a face. On the fingerprints of a dead man. Impossible. The phantom's DNA was female. The asylum seeker was male. Had the phantom somehow contaminated his fingerprints years ago when he submitted his asylum application? That made no sense. Why would a serial killer be anywhere near an immigration office? And even if she had been, how would her DNA get specifically on his fingerprints? The investigators did what any good forensic team would do. They tested again. Same asylum application. Same fingerprints. But this time they used a different cotton swab. And the phantom's DNA wasn't there. Different swab. Different result. Suddenly, after 16 years, After millions of euros spent, after 16,000 hours of overtime, after 300,000 euros in reward money, the truth began to crystallize. The cotton swabs. The cotton swabs were contaminated. Around the same time this discovery was being made, Austrian authorities made an announcement. They were decommissioning all cotton swabs manufactured by a company called Grainer Bio 1 International AG. The reason? The swabs, while properly sterilized to kill bacteria and viruses, still contained trace amounts of human DNA. DNA from the workers who had handled the swabs during manufacturing. The German police checked their supply records. The swabs they had been using for years, the ones they thought were the Mercedes of cotton swabs, double packaged and pristine, came from the same Austrian factory, Grainer Bio 1. On March 26, 2009, the police made an announcement that would shock the nation. The Phantom of Heilbronn didn't exist. She had never existed. Imagine being that woman. The woman who worked at the Grainer Bio 1 factory in Austria. We don't know her name. The police never released it. But imagine her life. She probably had a normal life, a modest life. Maybe she was one of several Eastern European women who had come to Austria for work. The factory paid decent wages. The work was steady. She probably stood at a packaging station, handling cotton swabs by the thousands, placing them in bags, sealing them, moving them down the line to be boxed and shipped. She would have worn gloves, certainly. She would have followed proper hygiene procedures. The factory was clean, organized, professional. The swabs were sterilized, heated to kill any bacteria, any viruses, anything that could contaminate medical samples. But DNA is different. DNA is extraordinarily hardy. A few cells from a touch, particle of skin, a molecule of sweat. That's all it takes. And the sterilization process that killed bacteria and viruses. It didn't destroy DNA. The technology of the time didn't require it. These swabs were intended for medical use, not forensic use. The packaging even said so, though apparently no one read that label carefully. For years, this woman went to work, did her job, went home, lived her life. She had no idea that her DNA was traveling across Europe in packages of cotton swabs. She had no idea that her genetic signature was being found at murder scenes, burglary scenes, drug scenes. She had no idea that she had become the most wanted woman in Europe. The police had created an entire psychological profile based on her DNA. They said she was calculated, dangerous, brutal, a master criminal. They said she could disguise herself as a man. They said she worked with different criminal networks across multiple countries. They said she was one of the most prolific serial killers in European history. But she was just a factory worker who touched some cotton swabs. When the truth came out, Grainer Bio 1 quickly released a statement. The swabs, they said, were never certified for DNA analysis, never intended for forensic use. The packaging clearly stated this. The company couldn't be held liable for police departments using their medical-grade swabs for criminal investigations. And technically, they were right. The swabs worked perfectly for what they were designed for, medical applications where the presence of bacterial or viral contamination was the concern. But forensic DNA work, that required a different standard. A standard that didn't exist yet. March 26, 2009, the day the announcement was made. You can imagine the scene at police headquarters across Germany. The embarrassment, the frustration, the anger. 16 years, 2 million euros, 16,000 hours of overtime, 300,000 euros in reward money. All for nothing. Chasing a ghost. Chasing DNA on a cotton swab. The newspaper Bild asked a question that captured the public sentiment. Are the heads of our police stuffed with cotton wool? But the embarrassment was just the beginning. The real tragedy was what had been missed while police chased the Phantom. Remember Michel Kieswetter, the young police officer murdered on the Versailles in Heilbronn? While investigators poured resources into finding the Phantom, the Real killers walked free. It wasn't until November 2011, 4 years after Michel's murder, that the truth emerged. The National Socialist Underground, the NSU, a neo-Nazi terrorist cell that had been operating in Germany for over a decade. They were responsible for 10 murders between 2000 and 2007. 9 victims were people with Turkish or Greek heritage, small business owners mostly, people who were killed for no reason other than their ethnicity. And the 10th victim? Michelle Kieswetter. The NSU had been carrying out a campaign of racist terrorism right under the noses of German law enforcement. But because the Phantom's DNA kept appearing at various crime scenes, including at the Kieswetter murder scene, investigators had been focused on finding a female serial killer instead of looking at right-wing terrorism. The Phantom's DNA contamination had obscured the real investigation. The NSU wasn't caught until 2 of its members died by suicide after a botched bank robbery in 2011, and the 3rd member, Beats Shape, set their apartment on fire and turned herself in. The apartment fire was meant to destroy evidence, but it failed. Digital storage devices survived, containing propaganda videos where the NSU explicitly claimed responsibility for all 10 murders. Michelle Kieswetter's murder could have been solved years earlier. The Real killers could have been stopped years earlier, but they weren't, because of contaminated cotton swabs. All those other cases connected to the Phantom, most of them were solved once police stopped looking for a fictional serial killer and started investigating the actual perpetrators. The people who had been convicted of various crimes while maintaining they had worked alone, they had been telling the truth all along. The Phantom had never been their accomplice. But from tragedy came change. The case of the Phantom of Heilbronn became a watershed moment for forensic science worldwide. In 2016, the International Organization for Standardization published ISO 18385. This standard defines the requirements for producing consumables that are genuinely free of human DNA contamination, specifically for use in collecting, storing, and analyzing biological material for forensic purposes. Laboratories across Europe and eventually across the world reviewed their procedures. New protocols were established. Manufacturers of forensic supplies had to maintain DNA exclusion databases of their employees. If contamination was ever discovered, investigators could check the DNA profile against the factory's employee database to identify the source. The cotton swab manufacturers began implementing clean room procedures specifically designed to prevent human DNA contamination. Special packaging, special handling, everything designed to ensure that the only DNA on a forensic swab would be the DNA from the crime scene. Forensic training programs added new modules about the importance of questioning evidence. Stefan Koenig, a lawyer from the Berlin Association of Lawyers, put it perfectly: DNA analysis is a perfect tool for identifying traces. What we need to avoid is the assumption that the producer of the traces is automatically the culprit. DNA evidence is powerful. It can solve cases that would otherwise remain forever cold. It can identify victims. It can exonerate the innocent and convict the guilty. But like any tool, it can be misused, can be misunderstood, can lead us astray if we're not careful. The Phantom taught us that evidence, no matter how scientific it seems, must always be considered in context. A DNA profile tells us whose DNA is present. It doesn't necessarily tell us when it got there or how or why. It doesn't tell us the story. We have to figure that out. Think about the factory worker whose DNA traveled across Europe. She committed no crimes. She hurt no one. She lived an ordinary life. But for years, she was treated as one of the most dangerous criminals in European history, and she never even knew it. Her anonymity probably saved her from a life destroyed by media attention, by suspicion, by the weight of being the Phantom. Think about the real victims. Lieselot Schlenger, strangled in her apartment in 1993. Joseph Walzenbach, the antiques dealer murdered in 2001. Michelle Kieswetter, the young police officer executed in 2007. Their real killers should have been the focus all along. Some of those cases have since been solved. Some remain cold. But for years, investigators were looking in the wrong direction because of contaminated evidence. Think about the investigators themselves. Dedicated professionals who did everything right according to the standards of their time. They processed crime scenes carefully. They collected evidence meticulously. They followed leads. They worked overtime. They did their jobs. But the tools they trusted were flawed in a way no one had anticipated. The Phantom of Heilbronn is a story about the intersection of science and justice. It's a story about how our best tools can fail us in unexpected ways. It's a story about the importance of asking questions, even when the evidence seems clear. It's a story about how a factory worker's DNA on a cotton swab became a phantom that haunted criminal investigations across 3 countries for 16 years. But most of all, it's a story that changed forensic science forever. Because of the phantom, DNA evidence is collected more carefully now. It's analyzed more skeptically. It's considered in context rather than treated as infallible proof. The woman without a face taught us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is question what we think we know. To look at the evidence and ask not just what it tells us, but what it might be hiding. To remember that behind every scientific result is a human process, and human processes can fail in ways we never imagined. Rain fades to barely audible. The Phantom of Heilbronn existed only in cotton fibers and crime scene reports. She was never real, but the lessons she taught us, those are very real indeed. Thank you for listening tonight. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps us bring you more content. Sleep well, and remember, the most dangerous ghosts are sometimes the ones we create ourselves. Story 2. Before we settle in for tonight's story, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, pull up your blankets, let the sound of the rain wash over everything else. If you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps us continue bringing you these stories. And now, let me take you to Belgium, to the heart of Europe, to one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in modern European history. Picture this: November 9th, 1985, a Saturday evening in Aalst, Belgium, a modest industrial city about 20 miles northwest of Brussels. The Delhaize supermarket on Parkland is busy with weekend shoppers. Families picking up groceries, parents with children, people going about their ordinary lives. 9-year-old David van de Steen walks through the parking lot with his family. His father Gilbert, his mother Therese, his 14-year-old sister Rebecca. They've just finished their shopping. It's a normal Saturday evening, the kind of evening that happens in millions of families across the world. And then gunmen appear, men in bizarre face paint, men with pump-action shotguns, men who move with military precision. They don't just rob the store. They hunt, they execute, they laugh as they shoot. David's family encounters the killers in the parking lot. The gunmen open fire. Rebecca screams, "Don't shoot! That's my dad!" Those are her last words. Gilbert is shot dead. Therese is shot dead. Rebecca is shot dead. David runs back into the supermarket, terrified, wounded, watching his entire family die in front of him. But the killers aren't finished. They follow him into the store. They single him out. They shoot him at point-blank range in the hip. He survives, but barely. When the smoke clears, 8 people are dead. 7 more are seriously wounded. Less than $25,000 has been stolen. This wasn't the first attack. It was the last, the bloodiest, the most brutal. But it was part of a 3-year reign of terror that killed 28 people and injured more than 40 others. A crime spree so violent, so seemingly senseless, so perfectly executed that it shook Belgium to its core and raised questions that echo to this day. Were these random criminals? Or were they something far more sinister? Were they part of a conspiracy? A plot to destabilize Belgium itself? Tonight, we're going to explore the Brabant massacres. The story of the Gang of Nijvel, the crazy killers of Brabant. 3 men known only as the Giant, the Killer, and the Old Man men who were never caught. Men whose identities remain unknown 4 decades later. This is a story about violence and mystery, about conspiracy and cover-up, about a nation that lost faith in its institutions, and about the victims, like 9-year-old David van de Steen, who would spend the rest of their lives searching for answers that may never come. To understand the Brabant massacres, we need to understand Belgium. Not the Belgium of chocolates and waffles and European Union headquarters. The real Belgium, the complicated Belgium. Belgium is a nation divided. Roughly 60% of the population speaks Dutch. These are the Flemish, concentrated in the northern region of Flanders. About 40% speaks French. The Walloons, concentrated in the southern region of Wallonia. There's a small German-speaking community as well. Brussels, the capital, sits right in the middle, officially bilingual, a constant negotiation between linguistic communities. This linguistic divide isn't just about language. It's about identity, about politics, about history, about resentment and distrust that runs deep. Belgium has had governments collapse over language disputes. The country has gone without a functioning government for record-breaking stretches because Flemish and Walloon politicians couldn't agree. In the early 1980s, Belgium was experiencing significant political tension. The Cold War was still very much alive. NATO had its headquarters in Brussels. Belgium was on the front line of the ideological battle between East and West. Communist parties had support, particularly in the French-speaking regions. Far-right movements were active, particularly in the Flemish regions. The country was a tinderbox. And then, in 1982, the attacks began. March 13, 1982. Two men are seen fleeing a shop in the town of Nijvel with a stolen shotgun. It's a relatively minor theft, the kind of crime that might make a small paragraph in the local newspaper. But it's the beginning. May 10, 1982. The same two men carjack an Austin Allegro. Then they steal a Volkswagen Santana from a car showroom. They're building their fleet, their arsenal. August 14, 1982. The gang crosses the border into France. They hold up a grocery store in Maubeuge. They're loading their spoils, food, wine, bottles of champagne, into their getaway car when two police officers arrive. Without hesitation, the gunmen open fire. Both officers are wounded. The gang escapes. This is when investigators start to notice a pattern. These aren't ordinary criminals. They use military-grade weapons. They wear disguises. Sometimes masks, sometimes bizarre face paint. They move with discipline and precision, and their targets seem almost random. Small amounts of money, food, wine, coffee, and tea. Nothing that would justify the level of violence they employ. September 30th, 1982. The Colruyt supermarket in Wavre, Belgium. Two gunmen enter during a busy afternoon. They demand money from the registers, but they don't just take the money and leave. They execute the cashiers. One employee is shot dead. Another is seriously wounded. The gang escapes with just a few $1,000s. And here's where things get strange. Witnesses describe the men as calm, professional. One witness says they seemed to be enjoying themselves. They weren't panicked. They weren't rushed. They took their time, loaded their spoils methodically, shot people with cold efficiency. Police begin to call them the Gang of Nijvel, named after the town where they first struck. But the Belgian public has another name for them. Les Tours Faux du Brabant Wallon, the crazy killers of Brabant. Over the next year, the attacks continue. October 26, 1982, a break-in at a weapons warehouse. Guns stolen. November 13th, a supermarket in Ukla. December 23rd, an attack on a taxi driver who fights back and escapes. The gang is active, violent, but they seem to disappear for months at a time, then resurface without warning. Investigators begin to piece together descriptions of three core members. The Giant, a man roughly 6 feet 4 inches tall, thin, with light brown or blonde hair, between 20 and 30 years old. The Killer, the main shooter, described as having Southern European features, dark curly hair, speaking perfect French with an educated accent. The Old Man, roughly 50 years old, tough-looking, in good shape, the getaway driver and lookout. But here's what makes no sense. The gang's targets are inconsistent. Supermarkets, restaurants, weapons depots, jewelers. Sometimes they steal large amounts of money. Sometimes they steal bottles of wine and cooking oil. Sometimes they leave money behind. The violence is the only constant. 1983 brings the horror into sharp focus. January 27, 1983. Temps, Belgium. A jewelry store. The gang bursts in, but this time something goes wrong. The jeweler, Jean Simusic, is a Polish immigrant. He's also connected to people who don't take kindly to being robbed. Some investigators later suggest he may have had ties to organized crime. Whether that's true or not, Jean Simusic fights back. A gun battle erupts inside the small shop. Bullets fly. Jean and his wife are both killed. But witnesses report that one of the gang members, possibly the killer, may have been hit in the chest. He goes down. His accomplices help him up and drag him out. They escape, but it's a close call. And then silence. After the jewelry store shooting, the Brabant killers disappear. Months pass. No attacks. No robberies. No sightings. Have they disbanded? Did one of them die from his wounds? Are they in prison for something else? The police have no answers. The investigation goes cold. But during this quiet period, something else is happening. Something that will become important later. In March 1981, a far-right paramilitary organization called Westland New Post had been founded by a man named Paul Latness. The WNP, as it was known, attracted former military members, police officers, and far-right extremists. They were virulently anti-communist. They had connections to other far-right groups across Europe. And in 1983, they began to fall apart. Paul Latness had informed police that one of his members, Marcel Barbier, had committed a double murder at a synagogue. This caused a massive rift within the organization. Latness was seen as a traitor. Several WNP members were convicted of running an illegal militia. Others were arrested for unauthorized possession of NATO documents. And then, in April 1984, Paul Latness committed suicide. Or at least, that's the official story. Some have questioned whether it was really suicide. His followers fractured into rival factions. The organization crumbled. Here's what investigators would later discover. During the early 1980s, members of Westland New Post, including some Belgian gendarmerie officers, had been ordered to covertly spy on and compile reports on the security arrangements at various Belgian supermarkets, including supermarkets that would later be attacked by the Brabant killers. Coincidence? Conspiracy? We'll return to this question. The timeline is significant. The WNP begins to dissolve in late 1983. Paul Latness dies in April 1984. The Brabant killers go silent from December 1983 until September 1985. 21 months of inactivity. Some investigators believe the silence is connected to the collapse of the WNP, that the killers were lying low while their support network fell apart, that they were regrouping, planning something bigger, but without evidence, it's just speculation. And Belgium, in the meantime, begins to relax. Maybe the killers are gone. Maybe they died in that gun battle at the jewelry store. Maybe they were arrested for something else. Maybe it's over. It's not over. September 22nd, 1985. A Volkswagen distribution center outside Brussels is broken into during the night. Professional thieves, clearly familiar with the facility's security procedures, steal a specific model, a Volkswagen Golf GTI. The security company is baffled. How did the thieves know exactly how to bypass their systems? The stolen Golf GTI matches the model used in several Brabant killers' attacks back in 1983. Investigators note this, but they're not yet alarmed. It's just a stolen car. Brussels has thousands of car thefts each year. 5 days later, everything changes. Friday, September 27th, 1985, approximately 8 p.m. The Delhaize supermarket in Braine-l'Alleud, a town just south of Brussels. The store is moderately busy with evening shoppers. 3 masked gunmen burst in. They're wearing face paint, grotesque theatrical face paint. They're screaming, roaring at customers like animals. One witness later says they seem to be enjoying the fear they were creating. They empty the registers. They shoot 3 people dead. 2 more are wounded. They steal less than $6,000. And then they leave. But they're not done. Not even close. 15 to 25 minutes later, less than half an hour after the first attack, the same 3 men hit another Delhaize supermarket. This one is in Overijse, about 12 miles away. How do they cover that distance so quickly? The roads are busy, traffic is heavy, but somehow they arrive at the second location with military timing. This attack is even more brutal. 5 people are shot dead. 1 is wounded. The gunmen move through the store methodically. They don't just shoot people who get in their way. They execute people. Customers hiding behind displays. Employees cowering in back rooms. They hunt them down. One witness describes the killer, the main shooter, as laughing while he fires, smiling, taunting victims. This isn't robbery. This is something else. This is terror. The gang escapes with about $25,000. In total, that night, 8 people are dead. 3 are wounded. $31,000 stolen. 2 supermarkets attacked within half an hour. Belgium is in shock. The newspapers scream headlines about the return of the killers. The public is terrified. Supermarkets across the country hire armed security guards. Police and military set up patrols around shopping centers. The Belgian gendarmerie, the national police force, puts every available officer on alert. Surely, after such brazen attacks, the killers will be caught. Surely, with this much attention, this much security, this much fear, they won't strike again. They strike again. November 9th, 1985, 6 weeks after the double attack. The Delhaize supermarket in Aalst is under heavy security. Armed patrols pass by every 20 minutes. Police are on high alert. Every supermarket in the region has been warned. Everyone is watching. It's a Saturday evening. About 7:30 p.m. The store is busy. Families doing their weekly shopping. The Van de Steen family, Gilbert, Therese, 14-year-old Rebecca, and 9-year-old David, are among the shoppers. Just an ordinary family. An ordinary Saturday. The gunmen arrive. Later, some witnesses will say they saw not 3 men, but 6 men in dark clothing. The descriptions vary, but what happens next is consistent in every account. The attackers don't just rob the store, they terrorize it. They're wearing bizarre face paint again. They're roaring, not the taunting employees. They move not the through elderly, the store shooting not anyone the children. They see. No one is spared. The Van de Steen family encounters the killers. Rebecca sees one of the gunmen aim at her father. She screams, "Don't shoot! That's my dad!" The gunman shoots Gilbert Van de Steen dead. Then he shoots Therese. Then he shoots Rebecca. All 3 fall in the parking lot. 9-year-old David runs. He's terrified, wounded. He makes it back into the supermarket, but the killers follow. They spot him, single him out. One of them walks up to David, aims, and shoots him at point-blank range in the hip. The bullet tears through his body. By some miracle, he survives. When it's over, 8 people are dead. 7 are seriously wounded. The gang has stolen less than $25,000. They've spent time loading 20 kilos of tea and coffee and 10 liters of cooking oil into their getaway vehicles. Tea, coffee, cooking oil, while 8 people lie dead and dying. 2 Belgian gendarmerie officers respond to the alarm. As they arrive, the gang opens fire on them. 1 officer is killed. The other is seriously wounded. The killers then shoot up a police car that tries to follow them. They escape using a little-known back road. Here's where things get suspicious. The supermarket was supposed to be under heavy patrol. Armed police were checking it every 20 minutes. But somehow, the gang knew exactly when to strike. They hit the store in a window between patrols. They knew which back roads to use. They knew how to avoid the dragnet that had been set up across the region. And here's the most damning detail. 2 young brothers, aged 7 and 10, were nearby. They had a hobby of collecting car license plate numbers. When they saw 6 men in dark clothing fleeing the scene, they wrote down one of the license plate numbers in their notebook. They reported this to police. The lead was never followed up. The boys were never questioned thoroughly. The license plate number went nowhere. Evidence collected from one of the getaway vehicles, a Saab that was found abandoned, mysteriously disappeared, just vanished from police custody. The Belgian public begins to ask questions. Were the police incompetent? Or was something else going on? Were the killers being protected? Did they have inside help? And then, after the Aalst massacre, the Brabant killers disappear forever. No more attacks. No more robberies. Nothing. It's as if they never existed. Over the next 4 decades, Belgian investigators would check 1,815 pieces of information, examine 2,748 sets of fingerprints, compare 593 DNA samples, and exhume more than 40 bodies. No one was ever convicted. No one was ever definitively identified. But theories abounded, and some of them are deeply troubling. The most prominent theory connects the Brabant killers to Operation Gladio. If you're not familiar with Gladio, let me explain. During the Cold War, NATO established secret stay-behind networks across Europe. These were clandestine military units trained to resist a Soviet invasion if one ever occurred. They were supplied with weapons, explosives, and communications equipment, all hidden in secret caches. The Belgian network was called SDRA-8. In 1990, after the Italian branch of Gladio was exposed, other countries began to acknowledge their own stay-behind networks. Belgium was forced to admit that SDRA-8 had existed since at least 1951. The network was officially disbanded in November 1990. But here's where it gets dark. In Italy, elements of Gladio had been connected to terrorist attacks in the 1970s and 1980s. The strategy was called tension. Create fear and chaos, blame it on left-wing groups, push the public to accept authoritarian measures. The Bologna railway station bombing in 1980, which killed 85 people, was later linked to far-right terrorists with Gladio connections. Could the same thing have happened in Belgium? Could the Brabant massacres have been a strategy of tension? The evidence is circumstantial, but it's substantial. Members of Westland New Post, a far-right paramilitary group, had connections to Belgian gendarmerie officers. Some of these W&P members admitted to surveilling supermarket security arrangements in the early 1980s, the same supermarkets that were later attacked. They claimed they were following orders but didn't know what the information would be used for. NATO stay-behind units were known to use robbery scenarios as training exercises. Plan the heist. Identify security vulnerabilities. Practice operational security. It was all theoretical, or so the official story goes. Paul Latness, the founder of Westland New Post, stated in a 1992 BBC documentary that his organization was working with government agencies in a Gladio-like arrangement. He suggested that they were part of Belgium's anti-communist infrastructure. He committed suicide in 1984, right in the middle of the Brabant killers' period of inactivity. In 1985, Belgian newspapers published articles suggesting that SDRA-8, the Belgian Gendarmerie, Westland New Post, and even the American Defense Intelligence Agency had conspired to engineer the Brabant massacres as a way to destabilize Belgium and justify a crackdown on civil liberties. A Belgian parliamentary inquiry investigated these allegations. Their conclusion: no substantive evidence that Gladio had committed acts of terrorism or that criminal groups had infiltrated the stay-behind network. But many Belgians didn't believe it. The inquiry was seen as a whitewash. Too many strange coincidences. Too much suspicious evidence that disappeared. Too many leads that went nowhere. In 2017, a breakthrough seemed to come. The brother of a former Belgian police officer, Christian Bonkowski, came forward. He said that Bonkowski had confessed on his deathbed to being the giant, the tall leader of the Brabant killers. Bonkowski had been a member of the Belgian Gendarmerie Special Forces. He had the training. He had the access. He fit the description. But Bonkowski had died, and there was no way to verify the confession. No DNA. No additional evidence, just a deathbed confession reported by a relative. In 2019, a retired police officer was charged with dumping weapons and ammunition linked to the case into a canal in 1986. Was he covering up evidence? Protecting the real killers? The case never went to trial. He was never convicted. In June 2024, Belgian federal prosecutors announced they were closing the case. After more than 40 years of investigation, they had nothing. The families of the victims were devastated. "This means the case is now buried," said Irina Polsterman, whose father died at Ulst. But then, in January 2025, just weeks ago, a new development. An appeals court in Mons ordered investigators to hear 2 additional witnesses. 2 witnesses who had been at the Ulst attack. 2 witnesses who had never been properly questioned. After 40 years, the 2 brothers who wrote down the license plate number. Finally, someone wants to hear their story. It's easy to get lost in conspiracy theories, in questions about Gladio and far-right networks and government cover-ups. But we must never forget the victims. 28 people died between 1982 and 1985. More than 40 others were wounded. Families were destroyed. Lives were shattered. David Van de Steen survived that terrible night in Ulst. He was 9 years old when he watched his entire family die in front of him. Shot in the hip at point-blank range, he endured months of painful recovery. His grandparents, Albert and Metch, took him in and tried to give him a future. His grandfather, Albert, spent 25 years investigating the case on his own, compiling evidence, talking to witnesses, pushing authorities for answers. He received threatening letters warning him to stop. He persisted anyway. When he died, he was pleased to know that a film about his grandson's story was being made. He never lived to see it released. In 2018, director Stijn Konings released Don't Shoot, Niet Schieten, a film based on David's memoir. The title comes from his sister Rebecca's last words, "Don't shoot, that's my dad." The film tells the story of how Albert helped David build a life from the ruins of that terrible night. It's a powerful reminder that behind every unsolved case are real people living with real loss. David Van de Steen is now in his late 40s. He has children of his own. He continues to advocate for the case to remain open. In November 2023, a memorial was unveiled outside the Delhaize supermarket in Ulst, an octagonal monument with 8 ginkgo trees, one for each victim. David stood there and said, "3 sides and 3 trees now symbolize my family." The Brabant massacres changed Belgium. They led to the abolition of the Belgian gendarmerie, which was replaced with a new federal police structure. The poor performance in this case, evidence that disappeared, leads that were never followed, suspicious coincidences that were never explained, destroyed public confidence in the institution. They also led to the creation of the Permanent Committee for the Surveillance of Intelligence Agencies. Belgium wanted oversight, accountability, a way to make sure that if there had been a conspiracy, if there had been a cover-up, it could never happen again. But the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who were the giant, the killer, and the old man? Were they common criminals, far-right terrorists, rogue elements of the security services, Gladio operatives following orders? Were the Brabant massacres random violence by a gang of psychopaths? Or were they political terror designed to destabilize a nation? The truth is, we may never know. Christian Bonkowski is dead. Paul Latinus is dead. Most of the original investigators are retired or dead. Evidence has disappeared. Memories have faded. 40 years have passed. What we do know is this. For 3 years, 3 men terrorized Belgium. They killed with impunity. They struck when and where they wanted. They seemed to have inside knowledge of police movements. And then they vanished, never to be heard from again. Either they were the most successful criminal gang in European history, or they were something else, something darker, something that the Belgian state has spent 40 years trying to bury. David Van de Steen once said in an interview that he didn't care whether the killers were criminals or terrorists or government operatives. He just wanted to know who killed his family. He wanted names. He wanted faces. He wanted to understand why his sister's last words, "Don't shoot, that's my dad," weren't enough to stop the bullet. In January 2025, 40 years after that terrible night in Ulst, 2 witnesses finally got their chance to testify. 2 brothers who wrote down a license plate number when they were 7 and 10 years old. Will their testimony finally break the case? Will Belgium finally get answers? Or will the Brabant killers remain what they've always been? Phantoms? Shadows? Men without faces or names who killed 28 people and disappeared into history. The rain falls the same way in Alst as it does everywhere else. The Delhaize supermarket is still there, marked now by a memorial. 8 ginkgo trees stand outside, the oldest trees on the planet, symbolizing hope and resistance. Inside, people shop for groceries just like they did that Saturday night in 1985. Life goes on, but the questions remain. And the victims, all 28 of them, and the 40 who were wounded, and the families who lost loved ones, they remain as well, waiting, hoping that someday, somehow, Belgium will tell them the truth. Thank you for listening tonight. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you these deep investigations. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that powerful people don't want solved. Story 3. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillows, find that perfect position, and let the sound of the rain create a cocoon around you. If you're enjoying this content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us continue bringing you these stories. Tonight, we're traveling to one of the most remote places on Earth. A place of extraordinary beauty and terrible secrets. Palmyra Atoll, roughly 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. A ring of about 50 tiny islands surrounding shallow turquoise lagoons, encircled by deep blue coral reefs. During World War II, it served as a naval air station. But by 1974, it had been abandoned by the military and returned to its natural state, an uninhabited tropical paradise, dense with coconut palms, scevola bushes, and towering Pisonia trees. A place where seabirds nested by the thousands and where the only sounds were waves and wind. In the summer of 1974, 2 couples sailed to this isolated paradise seeking escape from civilization. Mac and Muff Graham, a well-to-do couple from San Diego, arrived aboard their beautiful yacht, the Sea Wind. Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns arrived shortly after on the Iola, a deteriorating wooden boat barely seaworthy. By the end of August, Mac and Muff Graham had vanished. Their yacht was gone. Buck and Stephanie sailed back to Hawaii in the Sea Wind, repainted and renamed. They were arrested for theft, but there were no bodies, no proof of murder, just suspicion. 7 years later, a metal chest washed ashore on Palmyra. Inside were human bones, a skull with a broken jaw and a hole. And wrapped around one of the bones, still gleaming after all those years in the ocean, a gold wristwatch. This is the story of what happened on Palmyra in the summer of 1974. A story of paradise lost, of desperation and violence, of a trial that captivated America, and of questions that remain unanswered to this day. Malcolm Mac Graham III was born in Connecticut but found his way to California in the 1950s. He had worked for General Motors, but an inheritance from his uncle allowed him to pursue his true passion, sailing. In the late 50s, Mac moved to San Diego and became part of the city's vibrant sailing community. That's where he met Eleanor Laverne Eddington, known to everyone as Muff. Mac and Muff were perfectly matched. They shared a love of the ocean, of adventure, of the quiet solitude that comes from being at sea. They married and spent years sailing together, taking extended trips to remote locations. Their home port was Shelter Island in San Diego Bay, and their pride and joy was the Sea Wind, a 38-foot ketch that Mac had meticulously maintained and outfitted. The Sea Wind wasn't just a sailboat. It was a masterpiece, beautifully finished teak, an onboard machine shop with a lathe and acetylene welding torch. Every system carefully designed and maintained. Mac had provisioned the boat with more than a year's worth of food and supplies. Everything was organized, cataloged, prepared. This was a man who planned for every contingency. In June 1974, Mac and Muff set sail for Palmyra Atoll. Mac was 43. Muff was 41. They were looking forward to spending an extended period in this uninhabited paradise, away from the modern world. They imagined months of peaceful solitude, fishing, reading, exploring, living simply. But when they arrived at Palmyra, they found they weren't alone. Several other boats had already anchored in the lagoon. Amateur radio operators running what they called a discretion, ham radio enthusiasts making contacts with other operators around the world. Other cruising sailors, couples, and individuals who had also sailed south from Hawaii seeking adventure. Among them were Dwayne "Buck" Walker and Stephanie Stearns. Buck was 37 years old, a man with a long criminal history. He had spent time in prison for various offenses and was currently on the run. He and Stephanie had been arrested in Hawaii on drug charges, Buck for selling ecstasy, Stephanie as an accessory. Rather than face trial, they had decided to flee. Their plan was to sail to Palmyra, grow marijuana on the island, and live off the land while evading the authorities. Stephanie was 27, described by many who knew her as attractive and personable, but also manipulative. She came from a well-to-do family and had some sailing experience, though not nearly as much as she claimed. The boat they sailed to Palmyra, the Iola, was a testament to their situation. It was a deteriorating wooden sloop that had been patched together with fiberglass. The hull leaked. The auxiliary engine had frozen up during the voyage from Hawaii. They had barely made it to Palmyra at all. When the Iola approached the atoll's reef, it ran aground. A team of ham radio operators had to help dig it out. It was, according to one witness, remarkable that Stephanie had managed to navigate to Palmyra at all, given her limited experience and the Iola's condition. The contrast between the two couples could not have been more stark. Mac and Muff on their impeccably maintained Sea Wind, well-provisioned, well-prepared. Buck and Stephanie on their rickety Iola, poorly supplied, desperate. Buck and Stephanie had brought very little food. They had planned to live off coconuts and whatever they could grow. Buck began chopping down coconut trees to harvest the nuts, a destructive and unsustainable method that left scars across the atoll. Stephanie tried to plant a vegetable garden, but the island's crabs ate everything. Their marijuana plants, hidden in various locations around the atoll, were their main hope for future income. As the weeks passed, the other sailors departed. Amateur radio operators finished their expedition and sailed back to Hawaii. Cruising sailors moved on to other destinations. By late August, only two boats remained in Palmyra's lagoon, the Sea Wind and the Iola, Mac and Muff Graham, Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns. Two couples, alone on a remote atoll. One couple with everything they needed, the other couple growing increasingly desperate. According to the various sailors who had visited Palmyra that summer, tensions between the two couples had been building for weeks. It started with Buck's pit bull. In July, the dog had attacked Muff Graham. She wasn't seriously injured, but the incident created animosity between the couples. Mac confronted Buck about controlling his dog. Buck didn't take kindly to being told what to do. Then there was the matter of supplies. Stephanie repeatedly asked other sailors for food, tools, and equipment. She approached Mac and Muff multiple times, asking if they could spare provisions. Mac and Muff, generous by nature, helped when they could. But privately, in letters Muff wrote to friends back home, she expressed growing concerns about Buck and Stephanie. She didn't trust them. She found Buck particularly unsettling. Other visitors to the atoll noticed the same thing. Several would later testify that the Grahams clearly did not like Buck and Stephanie. The feeling apparently was mutual. Buck resented Mac's wealth, his preparation, his perfect bow. Here was a man who had everything while Buck had nothing. It gnawed at him. Stephanie's diary from that summer tells an interesting story. She wrote about visiting the Sea Wind multiple times. She described the boat in meticulous detail, the equipment, the supplies, the organization. In one entry dated August 5th, she wrote about drooling and dreaming over the Sea Wind. That phrase, drooling and dreaming, would later take on sinister significance. On August 28, 1974, Mac Graham made his last radio contact with the outside world. He had been communicating regularly with a ham radio operator in Hawaii, keeping friends updated on their activities. That evening, Mac radioed as usual,